Does this, can you hear me? All right, well, very good. It's exciting to talk about a brain because everybody in your audience has one. And typically when I say this, people giggle because sometimes you don't see the evidence of it, but it's true. Everyone that you know, personally or professionally, has a brain. And I'm addressing the notion of memory from the angle of how to leave memories on other people's brains, because that's a bit more exciting. Sure, it's nice to learn how to remember things for yourself, and that's good because that's how we function well. But if you manage to leave memories in other people's minds, then you live longer. And I'm sure that at some point you will think about passing on some legacies and some messages and some memories onto other people. So the guidelines that I will share that are practical as early as this afternoon will enable you to do just that. Leave a memory trace on other people's minds so that your legacy moves on and lives on. And that will help you in business, and that will help you definitely in your personal lives as well. Before we get into those practical guidelines, do you ever wonder why human beings have a brain? Why do we even have a brain? What would you say? To survive, and that's the ultimate goal. To control our bodies. Yes. What else? To social. Ooh, and of course, I love the quote that we heard this morning in terms of going far and going together. Yes. Socialization. Ours is a social species, which is why I'm more intrigued in the social function of memory than in the individual function. Because how could you even build relationships with other people unless you remembered what they are all about? And I understand that part of your community here is building relationships. And you can only do that and sustain them if you remember things about others and others remember things about you. And all of the reasons that you're mentioning here are correct. We have a brain so we can socialize, so we can communicate, so we can ultimately survive. And what ties all of those reasons together is one very basic reason for which we have a brain. We have a brain so we can move, physically move. A brain that doesn't move is not a brain that can socialize with other people. It is not a brain that ultimately can survive. And in that movement, what we know from neuroscience is that there is no movement that we make in terms of going forward, or it is possible to go backward, by the way, too, to move towards something or away from something, unless there is memory involved. Every single decision that the brain makes, your customers, for all of those who are still in business, is based on what you remember, not on what you forget. So that's the reason why I'm happy that you are at a session like this, because if you know how to build memories in other people's minds, that means you can influence their decisions. How many of you would like to influence where other people move next? Yeah, especially, and this goes for your family members as well, for your children as well. It is nice and satisfying at some point to influence where somebody else is moving, and ideally they move in your direction. So let's look to see how we do that, how we leave memory traces in other people's minds. Of course, easier said than done because memories are so hard to build. Are you noticing this for yourselves? I'm sure that at some point there are some things that you remember more so than other things. And let's just test your memory really quick, should we? Since we're talking about how memory is so important. In a moment, let's just imagine that you are in one of our labs and we put all of your brains in an fMRI machine and we want to see what's happening in there. I'm going to show you a string of letters, and let's see how quickly and how easily you remember them. So here's the first set. And if I take them away, what were they? So notice how that's fairly easy because there isn't a whole lot going on to keep in mind. Now let's punch it up a little bit more. So I'm leaving those there for just a bit, and I'm going to take them away. So let's see how you do. So notice how it's fairly unison. So the memories are fairly unified, or doing really good so far. Now, as we increase the amount of information, it's not going to be impossible, but it's going to be a little bit harder. So let's see how you do. So notice how it kind of tapers off a little bit toward the end. It goes strong in the beginning, but a little bit harder. Now, do we dare? Oh. It's just a bunch of letters. And don't feel bad because You're not alone. But what we just did here, by the way, is not all that different than what we do in business, for instance, because what do we do with our customers? We share some information and we hope they take that away. And we increase the amount and we share that and we hope they take that away. And then we show them some more. And at some point, memory does break. It will not be there intact forever. In fact, in the neuroscience studies that I conduct, I'm noticing that, especially in business people are more forgettable than they are memorable. Well, not you, but some people that we know are more are more forgettable than they are memorable. And since we're talking about neuroscience, what do I really mean by neuroscience? The experiments that I conduct look something like this. So people will have an EEG cap that you see there displayed on the screen. And through that, I monitor the electroencephalogram signals that are created in reaction to a stimulus. Usually the stimulus that I monitor is related to a business presentation of sorts, usually a sales presentation. I also put on people's chest an electrode that enables me to capture an electrocardiogram signal. For those of you who have had an EKG in the hospital, it's exactly the same signal, except they call it by the sexier German name. I also put on the computer itself, or sometimes I ask people to wear the actual glasses, an eye tracker, because typically you look to where you think. So it's nice for us to recognize where the attention goes and for how long, because if I know where you're looking, I'm more likely to know what you're, not necessarily fully what you're thinking, but at least that some thinking is taking place. And around his wrist and fingers, you may be noticing another device that's called a GSR, that stands for galvanic skin response. What happens is anytime you're faced with a stimulus, let's just say that you're watching a movie and you have a reaction to it, positive or negative, it doesn't matter, but the reaction nonetheless, your skin physically changes, or I should say the conductivity of your skin changes. And with this combination of signals, I get to study some variables that have some business consequences, because at some point you would love to know where your audiences are paying attention and for how long. Working memory simply means holding online some items until you complete a cognitive task, very much like you did with that string of letters. The reason you need working memory before long-term memory is because how could you remember something long-term unless something holds online right now for a while? The rest are fairly self-explanatory. Valence means how much the brain enjoys the experience, because at some point it's nice when things are pleasant, not also unpleasant. And the arousal in this case means how alert and awake people are during a session. Quite often we do notice people falling asleep during business content. We don't even have to see them physically falling asleep. If you look at the brain waves that get generated when you're falling asleep, your brain waves have a much higher amplitude and very low frequency. Whereas when you're watching like a Game of Thrones, your brain is going a lot faster, so the amplitude is lower, but the frequency is much higher. So we can tell a few things. These devices are not mind reading. I wish they were. If they were, we would all be sipping cocktails at the tropics. But I understand the breakfast here is just as good. The reason I'm enjoying the combination of these devices is because if I want to know how an audience reacts to a stimulus, like a business presentation, for instance, I don't have to ask them. I can look at these signals and I can tell if they're attentive. I can tell if they're engaged. I can tell if they're fatigued or something demands a little bit of a higher load. And it's good to not have to ask, because if you ask people what caught your attention or what kept you motivated to keep watching or engaged, people will tell you. But just like we showed, memories are not often reliable. We forget our lives almost as quickly as we live them quite some time. In fact, what I'm noticing after most business sessions is that after 48 hours, most of the content is gone. And I'm not so worried about all this bulk of forgetting, because we are humans. We haven't merged with robots just yet. Our memories are fallible. What I am interested in is being at least in charge of that 10% that tends to stay on people's minds long term. There's a small percentage that people tend to take away from what you share with them after a while, and that's fairly stable. However, if you're not careful to be controlling of that 10%, of that small percentage, what happens is not only do people forget a lot, but the little they remember is random. So even for my message for you today, this morning, if I'm not in charge of a message that I really, really want you to remember, your 10% would be different than your 10%, than your 10%. And in business, random memory gets us in trouble, because these days it's not just one person that needs to make a decision in your favor. It's usually a group. and you need to convince more people of the reality of your cause, whatever it is that you want to convince them of. So that's why you don't want just one single person's memory. You want a unified memory across a group. So that's why it's critical to control your 10% if you want to influence a group's decision. So let's look at guideline number one. If you want to control your 10%, which by the way will be my main message for the session this morning, first of all, you have to clarify it. I'm noticing that we get so enamored with a lot of information. And whenever you have some messages for your own audiences, there's a lot going on. Are you noticing the same thing? There's an overabundance of information. So in that overabundance, what's really the most critical? Sometimes in business, what I'm noticing is that people love agendas. I'm sure that you've had an agenda at some point. You like to organize the thoughts, and that is great. But the brain doesn't have energy for remembering just agendas and the list of topics. The brain has energy to remember one big reward. So make sure that your messages are linked to something that the brain finds satisfying. And it's usually a much shorter list than this. It will be very hard to remember with precision after 48 hours what that list contained. I'm often looking for good 10% messages outside of the business world as well. You may have seen this book. Do you know him? You may have seen his, he teaches at Berkeley. Brilliant writer. What I'm enjoying about this is that he has a very clear message. He says, I'm defending food. And of course, as you all enjoy to eat, you will probably agree with that message already. So it's a rewarding message. And to this, he has no more than 3 supporting points. He says, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. You don't have to agree with this message, but notice how easy it would be for your brain to remember this and go to the grocery store and do fairly well there. So what I'm advocating is, as you're thinking about other people's memories and impacting those, control your 10% by clarifying it first and having no more than one main message and 3 supporting points. The moment that you say, I want to influence somebody else's behavior, instantly ask the question, what is my 10% message? If it's clear to you, it will be clearer to somebody else's brain. Nebulous to you, definitely nebulous to somebody else's brain as well. And of course, there is no secret. Repetition is the mother of memory. Quite often as adults, we are as afraid of repetition as children are afraid of darkness. Because perhaps we think that, why do you think we fear repetition so much, by the way, in business? Why do you think we don't want to go back there again and again to the same message? Boredom, you're thinking that people are, yes.
You know, certainly the case of my wife, she's been taught that repeating yourself is rude.
And I like how you're mentioning personal relationships, because you're absolutely right. There is a fine line between repetition and nagging. So for those of you who are married, you know exactly what I mean. We're also fearing boredom. Nagging or coming across as remedial is indeed a potent fear. However, when it comes to business messages, which are hardly ever as simple as pick up those towels from the floor, I only have to say it once. In business, usually messages are more complex. Usually messages are things that people haven't heard about before, but they must, because they serve your cause in some way. There, you have to repeat a lot. And what do I mean by a lot? I've noticed in some studies that I've done where we had a sales presentation and somebody repeated their main message within a 5-minute presentation only 3 times, and that was not sufficient. We went up to 5 times repetition for the 5-minute presentation. That now got us closer to precision for the memory. We then increased the length of the presentation. So now if you're speaking for 10 minutes, we noticed that a 6 times minimum was necessary for you to be in charge of what people take away and not leave that to chance. We went up to 20 minutes. So we said within a 20-minute time frame, how much should you repeat? 6 times yet was still the minimum. 12 times was even better. And in that 20-minute presentation, I wanted to see what would happen if the presenter repeated their main message, what he really wanted people to remember, 24 times. I wanted to see, is there such a thing as nagging in business? Is there such a thing as there was that one? So after 48 hours, not one person said, you know, there was this one main message that kept coming up again and again, because it takes somebody else's brain a lot of exposure to detect your patterns. You know your patterns already when it comes to business content, but somebody else's brain has not detecting it yet. So what happens in business is this: you will say something that's really important to you and to your customers or your audiences, and you'll say it again, and then you'll say it again, and then you'll say it again, and then you'll say it again, and you'll say it again, And only then maybe people notice it for the first time. Then it takes a while to say, oh, so that's the repeated pattern that perhaps I am to take away. And from a neuroscience perspective, I'm about to debunk one of the biggest myths when it comes to business communication. I'm sure every single person here in this room has heard of this adage: tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them, then tell them what you told them. Is that true? That's called the T3 principle. Apparently, it originated somewhere in a military context, and it made sense for so long. But I had a hunch from a brain science perspective that if you're simply announcing to somebody else's brain that there is a message that's important, and then you do a lot of telling around that message, and then you summarize it at the end, it is not sufficient. So this is how that neuroscience experiment took place. I had 4 experimental groups. Group 1, we simply had the presenter engage the audience in a conversation. Do you ever, for those of you who are especially in sales, do you ever say, let's just have a conversation with a customer? There isn't anything formal and conversation. You're thinking, how hard can that be? So there is no particular message that people want others to take away. You're just simply having a discussion. Group 2, we had an agenda. Remember the famous agenda in the beginning. So at least they announced in the beginning what the session was going to be about. Group 3 was that infamous T3 principle. So they told them what they're about to tell them, then they did a lot of telling, and then in the end, they summarized the main message. And then group 4 is where my hypothesis was, this is just a schematic, so we had a lot more repetition than that, but the presenter announced in the beginning what the session was all about. And then he came back repeatedly to that same message again and again and again. The reason I'm using the word cognitive closure up there is because the moment that you give the brain something that is very concise and precise, and you're saying, this is so, then the brain tends to latch onto that, because if we have the choice between something that's ambiguous, something that is fairly fluid, and something that is non-ambiguous, and that is describing reality that will be so for a while, which one is the brain likely to pay more attention to and take away? We look for something that has long-lasting properties. And why is that? Because let's just face it, we're all cognitively lazy beings. Given the choice to think or not to think, what do we prefer? So if somebody shows up in front of you and says, this is so, I have discovered XYZ, you're more likely to zoom into those and say, this is probably going to last for a while. So I better pay attention, because I don't have to exert my cognitive capabilities again and again to figure things out. Somebody has already closed this topic for me. So how much cognitive closure do you provide for your own audiences and for your families as well? Because the moment that you show up and say, this is so, people are more likely to pay attention and engaged. Memory wise, by the way, I noticed that that T3 principle, that tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them, then tell you, had the lowest of all of them. And after all of the neuroscience studies that I completely create these brain scans. So what you're seeing here is a view from above. So those are the electrodes that will have been positioned on people's scalps. And we look to see, in terms of brain frequencies, we have various frequencies that get established when you're exposed to some stimulation, and where they appear in the brain. We can detect if a eureka effect has occurred. You know, that aha moment that sometimes you have. And what surprised me most in this study is that the only group that had the eureka effect was indeed that T3, but that was not associated with memory. I suspect that what happened is, if you're only announcing something in the beginning that's important, and then you do a lot of telling, and then at the end you summarize it, people say, oh, so that's what was critical. But by then the presentation is over and it's too late. So I'm advocating for a lot more repetition. And if we look at some of the cognitive variables, I was also intrigued to see with repetition how much lower the fatigue becomes. Do you see how the more you come back to the same message, the brain doesn't have to work so hard? You see how the fatigue level is the lowest? Yeah, for that group 4. Whereas working memory, which is a form of cognitive workload, remember how as I increased that string of letters for all of you, it became a lot harder to remember it. Notice how only when you are announcing something in the beginning and you're summarizing it at the end, you're actually making it harder for people's brains to hold on to something that should be important to them. So make repetition your friend. As we're looking at my 10% message, which is for you to control yours, make sure that you determine what is it that's important for people to remember and take away from your items. I'll pause here for a moment to see if there are questions or reactions. Yeah, go for it. I'll summarize it because I think I remembered. So I think I can hear you. So he's mentioning the women's brains versus men's brains and how they're different. Is that where you're going? So it's true that biologically speaking, there are some functional differences and some structural differences in men versus women, but they're not as pronounced as we have been led to believe. I'm sure that many of you have heard of that book, "Men Are from Mars, Women Are from Venus." If you're really staying true to science, that book should have been called in a less sexy way, "Men Are from Iowa and Women Are from Idaho." But that would have that would have probably not sold as many copies. When it comes to men versus women, you will find a lot higher or a lot more differences within each subset than you'll find across subsets. So if you look at all the males, for instance, in this audience, you'll find much larger differences between that group. And if you look at all the females in this audience, you'll find much larger differences within that group. What also influences our differences is not so much our gender, it's much more what you've been exposed to through your entire life, your experiences, the skills that you have developed. You're talking about some social skills, even those will impact how you're reacting to things. So think more in terms of those. Yes. Ooh, so I like where you're going because testing wise, he's asking a very important question. How do you isolate people who don't have some sort of interest in your area versus those who do? And I like that because you're already putting on a scientific hat. When I do the testing and I showed you the tools that we're using, we typically want people who are vested in that topic because we want to see what impact that would make. It's possible to do some pre-surveys and some pilot tests to see who is interested and who is not. But from our perspective, we typically recruit only people from business. So we don't use students, we don't use prisoners or other subjects for our tests because we want to see people who would be having the propensity to buy into those materials. Usually I study presentations that are from the tech space. I know that a few of you are from the tech industry. So we want to make sure that that brain is already equipped to receive that information. In a moment, I'm going to share some studies and some results from a cybersecurity presentation, for instance. So for that one, we recruited people who had already the knowledge. But I like where you're going because when you don't have the skills or the knowledge for that area, then cognitive workload might be a little bit heavier, then fatigue might be settling in, then motivation might be lower because that's not your vested interest. However, it's still satisfying to include those people because what if through some techniques you can impact even those who don't have any interest or any skills in that area. So that was a perfect question because I'm going to share that next. Yeah, go for it. I will reiterate it. You say your question. And
I'll give my question first. Two things. Have you done studies on what triggers a memory afterwards? Number one, what are the triggering factors? For example, I was watching a movie the other day, and there was a sign. It was a baseball movie. I was on the plane, and there was a sign, and it had a sign that reminded me of my father.
Yes.
And so that was one thing. The second thing is, and I know you said you only do business people. Does it work as well? Are children about the same, or does it require more or different creative repetition?
Ooh, I like where you're going. Yes.
And thirdly, I certainly am going to remember your outfit.
Thank you.
And I'm a little
so
jealous.
Sweet. I will address all of those. So let's hear his, and then maybe I can offer some more compact answers. Go for it. Let's see what your question is.
Question I have is, some of us, my age group, have a tendency to forget things more easily than younger people. And in your testing, can you show when people difference between normal memory loss and those who may be moving into some form of dementia?
Yeah, so this is actually a very profound. Let's start with that one first, because I know it's on all of our minds. Anybody here, with one exception, I don't think anybody here is younger than 25. Is that a safe assumption? After the age of 25, give or take a few years, the brain learns differently. It processes information differently. And as we age, our processing speed is a little bit slower. So for instance, if somebody said, add up in your head without writing it down, 947 plus 256. If I had asked you that question when we were her age, you would have been a lot faster. Now, as we age, it takes you a moment. That working memory, this is what I tested instantly in the beginning. That exercise becomes a little bit harder, holding things online until you complete something that is meaningful. So it's just all part of aging and a normal process for some things to be slowing down. When it becomes a little bit more of a cautionary tale is when things take you off your norms and you're suffering in some way. So for instance, you might not be aware of the date and the time. You might not be aware of a location where you are. It's normal to open the fridge and to have no idea what you're looking for, or to go to a room and have no idea why you went there. But if that is more pronounced and happens repeatedly, and you can't find your position in space and time, that's when things are becoming a bit more dysfunctional. You're all wearing pants, so that's great. That means everybody here is good and healthy. So look, yeah. Just the fact that you're witty like that already tells us that you're good. So notice for things that for when you're noticing some things that are getting you in trouble a little bit more, that's when things have to be checked out a bit more in depth. In terms of age, since we're talking about the age, for these principles, and I have two more guidelines to share, they go across ages, because even if you're addressing somebody who is 10, if you're addressing somebody who is 40, if you're addressing somebody who is 60, at some point, repetition will make a difference. Repetition is a matter of memory, so do not worry about age. In fact, the other two guidelines I have also span age, and they span gender, and they go across demographics. It's nice to pick some guidelines that will apply no matter what. We are noticing, however, that in the younger generations, even though the brain hasn't changed much in the past 35,000 years, what has changed is our threshold for stimulation. Are you noticing that these days it's a little bit harder to sit with yourself and not do anything? That's very, I was traveling to the East Coast, and the person next to me was so panicked when he had no devices that were charged. And the pilot announced that the entertainment system was down. So nobody could connect to anything. Just sheer panic. It was almost like, kill me now. Because for 5 hours, you have to live alone with your thoughts. This is actually a very bad proposition, because our brains are not built to stay present. There is very little value, evolutionarily speaking, in the present moment. Where do we want to be? We want to be in the future, because we said that we have a brain so we can move. And in order to move, you have to recognize, where do I go next? So I'm already anticipating the next moment. How do I increase the predictability of the next moment being safe? Is by going back into the past and retrieving some memories to say, if I go this way, I'm very likely to benefit in some way. That's why meditation is so hard. How many of you meditate, by the way, here? All 5 of you, 6 of you. And we have the deepest admiration for those of you who have raised your hands, because what you're doing is you're asking the brain to do something that was not necessarily designed to do, which is be here right now. Of course, there are many good benefits for being here right now. Now, the brain goes away and mind wanders for what percentage of your awake hours? I like how you're very dire. I'm hearing in the 90s. The world would not function if we were mind wandering that much. So about half the time, 49%, we're not fully here. We go somewhere. Now, when we go somewhere, where do we tend to go? Positive or negative thoughts? About 2/3 of that time that we're going away, we're not necessarily going away toward positive, because if the brain solves problems, then it's a brain that is more likely to anticipate where to go next. This is why when you have a solid message with a solid 10%, you are able, and you're keeping people right here, you're literally taking them away from their misery. So that's another reason why it's good to be solid, and it's good to be very precise in your messages. Before, I feel like you have another question. Yes.
Yes, we talked about one end of the memory retention or loss. Let's look at the other end. Since COVID, the communications between different age groups has changed dramatically. Younger people don't talk to each other. They talk to each other through their phones. What impact is that having on society and they themselves?
Yeah, so I like where you're going in terms of the impact of technology, because if we're saying the brain is not fully here, you put a phone in somebody else's hands, you're now almost inviting the multitasking to be happening. If we're talking about memory and forgetting that much, one of the reasons is because of multitasking and distractions. So if you ever want to improve the way that you remember, you'll see in a moment how attention is mandatory quite often for a memory trace to be built, then you have to work on your focus and you have to work on allowing your brain or inviting the brain to stay here. Easier said than done. But multitasking and distractions are some of the biggest culprits when it comes to memory loss. So there is that. However, you can still use devices in your favor to improve memory. I was just reading a study and I was so surprised because my hypothesis would have been exactly the same as the people who carried on the study. They were looking to see what happens to people who take a lot of photos with their phones. Are you the kind of person who goes around and immediately you see something that is exciting and you just get your phone out and it's like, I'm going to take a picture of this, but then you never revisit the photos? How often do you go back and you take you revisit those meals that you may have taken or that sunset that you may have captured? So the scientists were asking the question, do we still improve our memory for that moment of which you took a picture? So technology was involved versus, and even if you never revisit the picture again, is that instrumental? And apparently the answer is yes. So just the fact that you're convincing your brain that this moment is worthy of paying it some attention to, you're paying attention to it through your phone, but at least there's some attention, that's better than multitasking or not being there fully present. I will still remember your message about the cues, because what he's saying, what is triggering memories later on? Did you have a question as well?
A short one. Thank
Before
you.
I move on,
Yeah. Question. Are you involved in any brain research looking at memory prostheses?
In the sense of
any electronics or organic methods of enhancing your memory through implants or other means to afford effectively a memory prosthesis?
Yes. So for anyone who's following Elon Musk, I mean, obviously we're getting closer and closer, and it is possible to implant things. And you'll enjoy this experiment. For instance, it started decades ago. We're not allowed to do this anymore. But one of the reasons why you're even motivated to remember, memory is motivated. You will remember that which serves you well, and it enables you to move toward a target later on. So memory and motivation go together. If we look at a neuroscience perspective of all of this, what is the one chemical that will impact your motivation? One chemical without which we would all be in trouble. I know for sure that every single person here knows it. Dopamine. It would be so hard to function without dopamine. So this is how we used to believe that dopamine was involved in something that you like and you crave. Like tell me something that you like and you crave all the time that you can disclose publicly. So I hear alcohol, I hear beer, chocolate. Yes. What the newer neuroscientific finding we have about dopamine is that you don't need to have dopamine in your brain to like and to crave chocolate or beer. You have to have dopamine in your brain to go get it, because beer or chocolate don't materialize themselves out of thin air. Somebody has to go and pursue those things. So the brain, it makes a sense that from an evolutionary perspective, we would have built a brain this way because you couldn't have gone to hunt and gather and then come back and rest on your laurels. The moment that you have finished those resources, you have to have enough in your system to go and pursue again. Dopamine is the molecule that keeps us going. It's a molecule that is involved in motivation and drive and having enough energy to go get things. It is instantly linked to memory because you have to remember what to go and get, and what is rewarding and what is not. So to answer your question, we used to do these experiments. You would not like this, but you would take a rat, you would implant an electrode. You see, in my neuroscience research, we can only stay on the surface because our corporate clients don't allow us to surgically implant anything. but it's possible to surgically implant the electrode. So you would implant an electrode in a rat's brain in the area that secretes dopamine. And you teach the rat to press a lever such that each time that it presses that lever, it gets excited in that area and dopamine is released. And what you would notice is that you would get this movement. And this is effortful for a rat to go and press the lever again and again. And he would press it until it dies. That's the reason we're not allowed to do those experiments anymore. It wouldn't have been a bad death. It would have been a very pleasant way to go. But so to answer your question, it is possible to surgically implant things, but then you just have to be cautious about some other consequences that you're producing. Technology is advancing so fast. We now know to surgically implant things or to deeply stimulate the brain to where you would see a patient with Parkinson's stop tremors in real time, because now we know where to go and how deeply to stimulate. Parkinson's disease, by the way, is a dopamine deficiency disease. The reason why you have motor impairments is because there's not enough dopamine to keep the movement being flowing. That's why one of the cure, not fully cures, but the treatments that you would have access to is L-DOPA for Parkinson's, linked to the deficiency in dopamine. But these days, I mean, imagine motor. Have you guys read about that patient that had, he was a saxophone teacher, and he got, where should he get a tumor, but in the motor area of his brain that enables him to play his instruments. But now we know where to go, where to cut, how deeply to cut, where the patient is on the surgical table playing his instrument in real time as the neurosurgeons are in there making sure that they're cutting in the right area. So there is hope for all of us. If you know family members or if you have friends who are suffering from some conditions, I think that in the next few years, we're going to see major improvements as technology is enabling us to peek in the human skull and see what's happening. So let's move on to the second guideline, because I think you'll enjoy this. I know that I'm enjoying it, especially when it comes to business content, because I'm noticing that whenever you're sharing some knowledge with your audiences, you have some choices. You can stay on the surface or you can go a little bit deeper. And it bothers us as neuroscientists when we hear the principle simplify. Do you ever hear that mantra? Like if there's something that is just so complex, just go easy on people's brains. And I feel like we're babying people's brains way too much these days. So this is how the neuroscience study went, the one that I performed. I took that cybersecurity presentation I was telling you about. So already the topic is a little bit heavy. And it was from a vendor who was saying, if you use our solution, whatever solution that was, we will help you manage your IT. You can see IT there in the corner, information technology. And OT stands for operational technology, meaning that these days, physical objects are connected to the cloud. So you can even hack those. So for instance, if you have an oil rig that's connected to the client, to the cloud, that means you can hack it. So for IT, if somebody has a security breach and you lose some data, people lose their jobs. In OT, if you hack some of these physical equipment, people lose their lives. So that's why that becomes a lot more critical. So this vendor was saying, we know how to help you merge IT and OT by offering you those three things. So that was his 10% message. So that was group one. So we stayed fairly on the surface when we explained that message. Group two, we really punched it. It really doesn't matter what these details are, but just so you know, it went deep and it went complex very fast. And by complex, I mean you increase the amount of information. So notice how now there's a lot. That information is also diverse because it's not the same information multiplied 1,000 times. It's just diverse pieces of information in a larger volume. And also complexity happens when things are interdependent, such that if one small element goes away, then the whole system collapses. That's why you may have heard that sentence, if a butterfly bats its wings in Brazil, there's a tornado that is formed somewhere else in the world. In a complex system, even the smallest element can have a big impact. So what did I notice? Simplicity or complexity on somebody else's brain? What's intrigued me is that notice how much more motivated the brain is when it's exposed to that which is complex and not that which is simple. The only thing that must be simple is your 10% message. Beyond that, complexify, don't simplify. I was also noticing a few additional benefits that I think you'd like. Remember that GSR, that galvanic skin response? Notice how many more reactions per minute people have when something is complex. And also the amplitude of those reactions is higher, meaning that people are indeed emotionally intrigued by that which is complex versus that which is simple. And in that experiment, by the way, people did remember what we wanted them to remember. So the 10% message was very clear, regardless if it was in the simple condition or the complex one. This was a global study too, by the way. Also, I noticed that people remember something that is more difficult, but notice how much more precision we were able to achieve in that which was complex. And they remembered additional information. Sometimes I get the question, well, what happens if I want people to remember a little bit more than 10%? Is that possible? And it's possible when things are elaborated. So now to answer his earlier question, how does memory get triggered later on? And I love that question so much because you would hope that people encode some information when you talk to them. And 48 hours or later, they will remember something that was critical to you. But hardly ever do they go to their desks and they start recollecting things. Usually something happens in the environment that will trigger a memory. This is why the phrase, "this reminds me," is so popular, because you'll see something, you'll hear something, like you saw that image that reminded you of your dad. So what we do in business, we'll build some 10% messages around items that are likely to appear in somebody else's environment. So for instance, we were just helping somebody's presentation the other day. They were operating in some governance space. Governance, not the sexiest topic that you've ever heard. How were we rescuing it? We were rescuing it with some examples where people got in trouble because of some security breaches, and some CEOs did the wrong things, like United Airlines, for instance, or Boeing, or who else have you seen in the media lately? Uber appears in the media quite often. So we were picking these examples that are likely to be appearing in people's personal lives a lot more often. The CEO of Lululemon, for instance, if you're familiar with that brand, if you like sports, they got in trouble because they said that some women shouldn't be wearing specific clothing. So if you pick some elements that are likely to appear in people's minds and lives a lot more frequently, then a memory is more likely to get triggered that way. So that's one way that you can address that. I was also intrigued in here that people from different countries were not necessarily paying attention differently to complex information. So this is collective eye tracking for everybody who was in that group from the US population. And if I look at the German population, they were paying attention in a similar way. The reason I even did that study, by the way, is because after an event like this, somebody came to me and said, you know, it's really the Germans that love details. The American people, not so much. And I said, wait a second, are you saying that the American people are superficial? He said, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. So we were able to look at this and say, look, we're not really all that different. Remember, men versus women, or US versus Germany. So I'm advocating, do not simplify your complexity. Yeah, sure, you may have a simple 10% message for somebody, and that's fine because that's essentially a conclusion. But bring that conclusion to life with a lot of complexity and some layers, because it's the layers, it's the elaboration that will help trigger memories later on. I suspect that's the reason why people remembered even more concepts, because when you have something that's elaborated, you're increasing the chances of a memory being triggered later on at point B. So don't simplify, but on the contrary, complexify. And within this, of course, in order to get the brain to remember things, you have to first get it to pay attention to things. And it's not that we pay attention in only one way. Luckily, there are multiple ways of paying attention. You can get the brain to pay attention in a bottom-up kind of way, meaning that you can impact the physical properties of a stimulus, like how large something is or how loud something is. And that's one way to get attention. There's also another way, which is a top-down, meaning that if you know people's goals, I like your question earlier in terms of people's skills or knowledge. If you know people's expectations, you can impact the attention that way as well. And I'll give you an example of both. In a moment, I'm going to share some ads from a campaign from Colgate. I know that every single person here knows Colgate. And tell me what you're noticing in these ads. So here is ad number 1. And here is ad number 2. And here is ad number 3. So what did you notice? It's usually, yeah, it's the spinach in the teeth, and it's usually the guys that take it. So more power to you guys. What else? Oh, so see, now a few of you are mentioning that there may have been some other things happening in those ads. So upper left, how many fingers does she have? Upper right, what's he missing? And then lower left is, I think, what you were noticing. Whose arm is that? Yeah. And of course, their conclusion for their campaign was this one. But notice how there are some physical properties of a stimulus that sometimes go unnoticed. So it's up to you. You are a choreographer of somebody's attention. You can decide where you want the attention to go and where you don't want the attention to go. But just know that physical properties of a stimulus are not the only one thing that you can master. Here are a few other things. So if you know somebody's goals, you can definitely master where they look. Notice your own attention right now. So there are two almost similar pictures in those iPads. There's only one symbol that repeats across the two. Can you find it? And it's not a trick question. There really is only one symbol that repeats. Which one? There's only one thing that is in both. And I'm sure at least one person is going to detect it very quickly. Yeah. Only one thing. Yeah, it's the exact same symbol. Not a trick question. I know you'll notice it. And even when I say it, yeah, no, I think you're doing good. I think you're about there. No. I'll give you a hint. Look for an insect. Yeah, somebody said it. The ladybug. Yes, now you saw it. It says it's the ladybug. But notice the reason for this brief exercise is because as you're looking at the screen, I gave you a goal. So it's a lot less likely that you'd multitask the moment that the brain has a goal. So as you're thinking about how to build attention in somebody else's brain, do you know what their goal is? Because here's a screenshot from somebody's presentation, by the way. Sometimes people come to us and say, we have 77 slides. There's no way people will remember. However, if they have a clear goal through that longer presentation, it is a lot easier for the brain to remember. Make sure you know your audience's goals, personally or professionally, doesn't matter, and attention is more likely. It is the same with knowledge. The moment that you know what people know, attention is a little bit more likely. So for example, I was reading these studies of accidents between car drivers and motorcycle drivers. A car driver is much more likely to run over a motorcycle when that car driver has never driven or ridden a motorcycle before. Because the moment that you know what the other person knows, it's a little bit easier to cater to attention. Do you know what other people know? Because, like, for instance, I'm an aspiring tennis player. I almost call it addictive tennis player. And I'm noticing that it's a lot easier to return somebody else's serve, especially if it's a fast one, if you know elements of their body to look for. That's why pros can return 140 mile an hour serve. I think the fastest ever was about 152. And the stat goes, yeah, sure, that was the fastest serve ever, but that serve was returned. So that actually, to me, is more impressive than the fact that somebody can hit a very high, because you have to recognize how in the world would somebody's brain be able to react so fast. The reason we can react so fast is because we know what to look for. Knowledge sharpens our focus. And I'm so impressed that you would be at sessions like these. And I hear that you have amazing speakers. Congratulations. And you know what's going on and you keep on learning, because the more you know, the easier it is to remember things. So keep on learning and keep your brain sharp. See, these kinds of things are easier to process when you're dealing with experts. Yeah, sure, it may look complex to us novices, but if you know what somebody else knows, then attention is more likely. And it's the same with expectations. If you know what to expect and what will happen next, it's a lot easier to pay attention. Do you ever buy a car and then suddenly everybody on the highway drives the exact same car? The moment that you have paid attention to something and it feels familiar, you kind of sort of know to expect it, and now your knowledge is different, of course you're noticing that thing, whatever that thing is, more. Where would you rather be a pedestrian? In London, for instance, where car drivers expect pedestrians, or in San Francisco, in some areas where people were just like, I would have never expected somebody to be walking here. Expectations will also sharpen focus. So for instance, if you want to build some anticipation for what happens next, if you want to put some expectations in people's minds, then it doesn't matter if you're offering something that is very complex or dense, because the brain will have paid attention a little bit differently. So as we're looking here for point number 2, as you control your 10% message, the extra details are not going to bother somebody else's brain. Complexify versus simplify. As long as your 10% message is clear, then you can elaborate. Sometimes I get the question, well, if people only remember 10%, why don't you just give them 10% and then just call it quits? Exactly. So they will remember the 10% as long as the 90 is built in such a way that it does justice to the 10. It is because of the 90 that the 10 can rise to the occasion. For the 90, do add the elaboration and do add the complexity. We synchronize. The brain is a complex organ itself. We synchronize better with a complex signal than with a simple signal. And one last guideline as we get closer to the end of the session, I was noticing that throughout the neuroscience experiments that I've been doing, yeah, sure, we've been complexifying things and adding the layers and the elaboration, but it's not so much that you added more volume or interdependent things or diversity. At some point, you twisted people's thinking. At some point, you offered something that the brain did not expect. There's a difference, by the way, in the brain between novelty and surprise. Novelty is something that you haven't seen or experienced before. Surprise is something that you have seen or experienced before, but did not expect. If you think about the expectations, and we're just talking about expectations, surprise is always bad, biologically speaking. Why is that? Because we are talking about the brain being on constant fast forward. We want to predict what happens next. And what is surprise but a failure to predict what happens next? So that's why as you're thinking about content or messages that you want other people to remember, at some point ask the question, am I providing a twist to the familiar? I was impressed with what this bookstore did somewhere in Turkey. What does a bookstore want? People to come in and buy some books and have some customers. And notice their ad to their bookstore. Yes. So that's what I mean by surprise. It's not so much that you haven't seen this before. You have seen it before, but not in a way that you could predict in here. So can you twist and can you play off of the familiar? Otherwise, when we don't, the brain habituates very quickly. So if you're giving the brain something that it knows and it knows and it knows and it knows, after a while, it will look elsewhere. It's almost like an invitation to multitask. So there are some advantages to familiarity, which I'm advocating for a lot as a foundation, because for instance, let's just say that we had a lot of money here and I could do some, this time, not EEG studies with you, but fMRI studies. Those are a lot more expensive. And I could put all of your brains in an fMRI machine and I would showcase in front of your eyes some pictures that you haven't seen before, but I'll display them so fast that your conscious brain could not recognize them. Anything under 250 milliseconds would do the trick. And then outside of the scanner, I would show you this initial set of pictures and then a new set of pictures. And I would ask, which ones do you prefer? What do you choose, familiarity or novelty? You choose familiarity, even though you have no idea that you saw the other set. You choose familiarity because familiarity invites us to predict more accurately what happens next. But after a while, we habituate to what is familiar, because tell me some things that you no longer notice in your environment, especially at work. Some things that initially caught your attention, but after a while, they just kind of fall in the background. Yeah, so whatever is on your desk initially was intended to pictures. Yeah, so you may have posted a picture because you said, oh, this is just going to capture my attention, but after a while, you hardly ever see it. Perhaps you don't even hear air conditioning systems running anymore. Perhaps your neighbors mowing their lawns, you probably don't hear those anymore. And thank God that we have this capability, because imagine if you couldn't habituate to the sound of your own breathing. You would be going nuts if you had to pay attention to every single moment as if it was new all the time. So we familiarize. This is why I'm advocating for, yes, a familiar foundation, but on top of that, have the courage to twist that which goes beyond the familiar. I do this a lot in neuroscience studies that I conduct. So for instance, this was a fairly dull brochure or a white paper from a telecom company. In version 1, the page was saying, what's holding you back? This was about some telecom systems that should have been faster. And you're seeing a fairly predictable photo of a woman looking fairly concerned at her computer screen. Something is holding her back. But then we replace that with this giant iron bird that's being held by these ropes. It's always almost like a scene from an epic movie. And notice how it's not so much that this is the eye tracker heat map. So wherever you're seeing the more intense map is coming from the eyes. So this is visual attention. Notice how it's not so much that we're paying attention to that more unusual picture, but when you do the more unusual pictures, you're paying more intense attention to that final paragraph that was the most important on that page. So that's why I'm noticing that whenever you have something that is less predictable, and quite often that comes from something that is complex, then you get the brain to pay attention more and remember with more precision. And I'll end with this story because as we are after something that's a bit more complex, but also with a twist, twisting the familiar, I'm very impressed with them. I know that every single person here is familiar with them. What you may not be familiar with is the fact that the creators of the show boast degrees in math and physics. They have PhDs from Yale and Harvard in computer science. And quite often, this show will appeal to small kids, would appeal to adolescents, but even to PhD levels. And I'll give you an example. In one of the shows, Marge, everybody knows Marge, she's at a baseball game. And very briefly on a Jumbotron, you see this multiple choice question. Anybody here a math buff? Because this may be a cutesy little thing to do, but these are no ordinary numbers. The first number is considered a perfect number. What's a perfect number? If you find all the numbers that this number is divisible by, and you add them all together, you end up with the original number. The second number is considered a narcissistic number. What's a narcissistic number? If you count the amount of digits, in this case, it's 4, and you raise each one of those numbers to that power, so the power of 4, and you add up those results together, you end up with the original number. So it suggests that the number, because it recreates itself, it's in love with itself. So therefore, it's a narcissistic number. And then the third one is considered a Mersenne number. Mersenne was a 17th century mathematician who would study prime numbers, and that's a Mersenne prime number. So imagine this scene was there for just about 8 seconds, but people who really know their math would have appreciated the level of complexity and the slight twist to the familiar. So that's the aspiration that I have for all of you as we think about controlling your 10%. Do go for something that's a bit more unconventional or something that twists us and has some layers of depth, because your own audiences will be paying attention better. And as a result, remember what you want them to remember. It's been a pleasure to share these guidelines with you. And I guarantee that as you use any or all of them, you will be able to control your 10%. As a result, not only be successful in business, but also live longer. Buddy, back to you. Thank you.
Sure. How we doing on time, Dave? You got a couple minutes?
Yeah, if
have a
we
couple
have
minutes,
any other
Dave?
questions.
Want to
Yeah,
take
go
some
for it.
questions?
Yeah,
I do
please.
too. Go to the mic. I'll get mine out of the way first. Do you have an? I had high expectations, and I think you crazed my expectations even more. So the bar is high, and we're gonna have more good speak. Here's the one. Can you have like 1 or 2 nuggets we can take with us in regard to subconscious?
Ooh, so, yes. So if we're talking about the subconscious, that's not always the easiest to obviously see or control. This is why I'm enjoying the neuroscience tools that we use, because we go to those implicit reactions without asking people. But quite often, that which comes automatically to you, let's associate that in some way with the subconscious, something that happens reflexively or automatically. You can control that for other people and even for yourself. So if we're thinking about something that is reflexive to the brain and body, what are some of those aspects, especially when it comes to business? I'm advocating often for this notion of controlling your environment. The brain wants to control where it's at. So anytime you have a message with someone, I'm so glad you asked that question. What's my 10% is control yours, because I know the brain wants to be in control. So if you're associating your products, your services, your ideas with something that puts somebody else in better control of where they're at, already you have a reflexive reaction from somebody else's brain. What else gets us there? I'm impressed that you're such a tight group. Altruism is a reflexive reaction from somebody's brain. If I said right now, it's about to rain and I'm going to buy an umbrella for myself, it will be one reaction. But if I said it's raining outside, I'm going to buy an umbrella for you. Now you see how your brain reacts a little bit differently. We recognize that ours is a social species, like you said in the beginning, and we have to survive together, not just alone. We go much farther, like your quote said. So anytime you two associate your messages or your ideas, your products, by saying, if you use this, you will be in better service to somebody else, that will also get you there in a very reflexive kind of way. I'll give you a third one, which is aesthetics. I thank you for the compliment for the shoes. I really love anything that is related to aesthetics, and you'll be able to use the same in business because, yeah, sure, to some degree, you could say beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, but there are some aspects of beauty that are universal. What are they? Anytime the brain can perceive some contrast, like I heard you smile just briefly at that last picture that I shared, the brain enjoys that. So that's associated with beauty. Hierarchy of information, when it's clear what's one main message and what are some supporting points, the brain enjoys that and equates it with something that's aesthetically pleasing. What else goes there? Proximity, when you're grouping like ideas together, the brain enjoys that, considers it to be beautiful. So there are some dimensions that will apply to business as well. Thank you so much for that question. We have time for one more.
I'll make it quick. So this was a fabulous presentation. Thank you very much. And virtually everything you said relates to what I do, which has nothing to do with business. I'm a therapist.
Oh, even better.
But I have an agenda.
Yeah.
You know, I have something to sell.
Yes.
But it also has to come from the people in the room, the clients in the room, whether they're a couple.
Yes.
And so the one thing you said about eyes, you know, I can follow somebody's eyes and know what they're interested in. But are there more things like that so I can't put wires on their head when they're in the office.
Not yet. Not yet.
Yeah, right. It's intimidating sometimes, but I do have to follow their reactions because that absolutely determines what I do or don't do next.
Yeah. Yeah.
And do you have translations for those brain diagrams, you know, that come out from the computer, that turn into facial and bodily movements?
When you're looking at,
so
at
I
their
can
reactions.
interpret that you're now very interested in what I'm saying.
Yes. Very interested in what you're saying. And for your job as a therapist, I mean, obviously you'll stay in business for a long time if you have this person right now and their attention and you're monitoring how their reaction, but also if the person comes back and ideally carries your message to 100 of their friends. That would be an ideal proposition for you, I would imagine. So memory is very important. Here's one element that we haven't addressed after repetition, which is also important for your business, is a strong emotion. How much emotion are you enabling in the moment so that the effect can linger on? Other than repetition, there is no other variable talked about more strongly in the literature of memory than emotion. And often in business, whether it's those settings that you're describing as a therapy, whether it's a business presentation, it really doesn't matter. I'm noticing that often we stay neutral. Especially in our context, we leave people flat. If we're looking at the ECG signal, if we're looking at the GSR signal, hardly ever do we get, that's why we get so excited when there's some peaks. Like if you're watching a movie, you will have maybe 20 peaks per minute, sometimes even more, depending on the movie. Business content, we're lucky if we see 3 or 4. I'm curious to know how many peaks per minute we would be seeing in your therapy sessions. But often wonder, can there be a strong emotion that I can allude to? Do you feel like in your sessions, there is a strong emotion that you can attach your practices to?
Yeah, I think so, because what we typically do, let's say in a couples counseling, is if they just keep doing the same old thing they're doing all the time at home that they're complaining about, we don't say anything.
Yeah.
And then if they do something different that's good, we go crazy and kind of make a big deal out of it.
Yes.
And then they remember that because that's what gets reinforced.
Exactly. That is great. And when you're thinking about that good thing that they should be repeating, can you tie it to a really, really strong emotion? And why am I, especially toward the end of your therapy session? So here's some studies that I think will be very useful to all of us. If right now, after this session that's about to be over, all of us went to an area and we would all plunge our hands in ice cold water, that gets that dopamine that we're talking about. We will have a dopamine spike. The intensity is so strong that the learning that would have happened in this session would be much more longer lasting than if we hadn't done something that's so emotionally intense. And it's, by the way, these findings are not new. If you go back to like the 18th century, people, you would laugh about this. People used to throw their children in the river after a learning session. I think they had the intuition that if I follow this with a really strong emotion, something is going to stamp that moment and it will be more long lasting. So my invitation to you, especially toward the end of a segment, whatever the segments are for you, whether it's a therapy session or something else, can you find the equivalent of plunging your hand in an iced cold water? And when the answer is yes, then that memory will be stamped for a much longer time. Thank you. So I think we have one more question.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm glad I came over here kind of so I could fully appreciate your shoes. They're
Oh, yeah.
wonderful. Also, thank you. A very engaging presentation. Really enjoyed it. We try to avoid political discussions here at Rotary, but I
Sure.
just have to ask, have you had any clients who have been political candidates, political action committees, political parties, trying to kind of learn how to, adjust their presentations to fulfill some of the things you've talked about today?
Yes. So let's address some messages that will apply to that context. Very much like you, we try to stay away from those as much as we can. Every so often we will have a client like that. And we can associate those clients. Here's an easier and comparable situation with famous artists, for instance, or famous musicians, because in a way, they're now not different. They are public figures and they hope that whatever messages they transmit will linger on. If you think about the notion of control, what was the Brexit mantra, since we're talking about politics? Take back control. And that happened. So that's why I'm glad that you asked the question about what is something that's subconscious, what is something that is automatic. So control would be one of the best phrases that you can associate. Control, and then you can't go wrong with something that happens in the future because the brain wants to anticipate that. What is something else that we can learn from strong political messages, whether you agree with them or not, that we can also see transferred to singers, for instance, is the portability of a message. The other day, somebody asked me, why is Taylor Swift so popular? It seems like you can't enter a store, you can't go to a mall, you can't be in an area where you don't hear those songs. And one of the biggest criteria that she has is that the message is portable, meaning that you can take it from one context and use it in another. Like a song like Shake It Off. That doesn't necessarily have to apply just for singing or personal relationships. It could apply to business. It could apply to a therapy session. It could apply to sports. It could apply in so many areas. So as you're thinking about your own 10% message and political messages and any other kind of messages or entertainment wise, also often wonder, does that message transfer to different contexts? And that will offer cues as well, triggering the memory, because the more portable it is, the more repetition and triggering elements it will have as well. So after a session like this, you can all be as memorable as Taylor Swift.